Harry S. Truman, the President of the United States and Commander-in-Chief of the American military, is said to have made the most contentious choice of the 20th century, possibly of all time, when he decided to drop the atomic bomb on Japan in the summer of 1945. No other decision is as contentious, and no other event has had such a profound impact on humanity. When Harry Truman had the guts to drop it, many of the young Marines and soldiers in training or relocating to the Pacific survived the war. This belief was ingrained in their young brains when they heard the news, and the majority of them never bothered to question whether it was true. Their sons have attempted in recent years to support their father's beliefs, once more without carefully considering the circumstances underlying the choice to drop the bomb and the events that preceded it. In actuality, however, Emperor Hirohito, of Japan's choice to accept the conditions of the Allied surrender and end the war, was the only one that saved their lives. Truman never really decided to use the bomb. Many Americans, including several in prominent positions in the military and administration at the time, have long held the view that the atomic bomb was unnecessary, despite the fact that millions of Americans still think it ended World War II. Their argument that the White House understood Japan's time was running out, and that the use of atomic weapons was driven more by post-war anxieties than by the desire to avoid an amphibious invasion of Japan, is supported by previously secret documents that have recently been made public by the National Archives. Principals like General Leslie Groves, the officer in charge of the nuclear project, have also disclosed that President Truman never actually made the decision to drop the bomb. Rather, he merely permitted plans that were already underway before he was thrown into office to proceed. Essentially, the choice to attack Japan with atomic weapons was made long before Truman ever knew they existed. Constructing the bomb. In actuality, American studies into the potential for developing potent weapons through nuclear fission began weeks before World War II broke out. 3 European scientists met with famous physicist Albert Einstein in July 1939 and convinced him to write a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt informing him that Germany may be developing a device that would cause a nuclear explosion. Nearly a month before Germany and the Soviet Union attacked Poland and World War II formally broke out, Einstein wrote a letter on August 2, 1939. In response to the Einstein letter, the United States initiated a similar but mostly fruitless endeavor, while British scientists were already developing such a weapon. A team of American scientists traveled to England in 1941, where a significant amount of nuclear research was being conducted. The British effort so impressed the visitors that they advised in December that a full-scale nuclear project begin in the United States. Even though no American scientist had previously thought that nuclear fission would be crucial to the war, British nuclear specialists traveled to the United States to collaborate with their American colleagues on research aimed at developing a nuclear weapon after President Roosevelt approved a research program known as the Manhattan Engineering Project. Colonel Leslie R. Groves of the Army Corps of Engineers, who had overseen the Pentagon's construction, was named project head after the War Department took over the project in September 1942. The first controlled release of nuclear energy, fission, was accomplished on December 2, 1942, by Dr. Enrico Fermi, a scientist at the University of Chicago who was born in Italy. Fermi's successful experiment marked the beginning of the nuclear era and demonstrated that creating a nuclear weapon was feasible. Finding a way to keep the radioactive material inert until the intended detonation location was the next stage. By splitting nuclear material into two masses and then shooting one into the other to produce an explosion, scientists from the Manhattan Project were able to address the challenge. Placing the nuclear material between 2 tons of conventional explosives was an additional technique. The plutonium would compress and then grow again in a massive explosion because to the shock waves from their detonation. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima employed the first approach, while the bomb dropped on Nagasaki and the Trinity site in New Mexico used the second mechanism for the first nuclear detonation. President Roosevelt didn't even tell his vice presidents about the nuclear secret since it was so secret. Truman, the third of Roosevelt's 3 vice presidents, was not elected until November 1944 and did not assume the position until January of the following year, just weeks before FDR's passing. Locating an appropriate delivery car. Any weapon must be delivered to a target in order to be effective, and a nuclear bomb must be detonated in the air to have the most impact. The artillery of the time was unable to deliver a nuclear weapon because to its limited range and the lack of guided missiles. An aerial bomb was the only way to deliver it from the air. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, a massive long-range four-engine bomber that was being developed concurrently with the bomb, was the sole appropriate delivery vehicle in the U.S. inventory in 1943. The B-29 was first designed in 1940 with the intention of carrying out strategic bombing missions against Germany from bases in the northern British Isles and North Africa at a very long range. Planning for a special combat unit to deliver the new armaments when they were built started even before the first Superfortress reached operational service, despite the birthing issues plaguing the B-29 program. General Henry H. Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, chose Colonel Paul W. Tibbets, Jr., a veteran bomber pilot from Columbus, Ohio, who had seen action in Europe and North Africa but had no prior experience against the Japanese, to command the new unit, which would be known as the 509th Composite Group. His deputy was chosen to be Lieutenant Colonel Thomas J. Klassen, a Pacific veteran who had received the Distinguished Service Cross for a 1943 mission in a B-17 Flying Fortress bomber. The operational unit responsible for dropping the nuclear weapon, the 393rd Bombardment Squadron, was already under Klassen's command. The majority of Tibbets' staff officers were selected from his previous group, although some were selected because to their unique qualifications that made them especially valuable. The nuclear secret was known only to Tibbets alone. The other members of the group were only aware that they would be dropping a certain type of bomb when they entered combat. They began to call the weapon they had no knowledge about the gimmick. Tibbets was solely responsible for staffing and organizing his new team, as well as choosing the training base. He selected Wendover Field, an isolated base in the desert of Utah, that had served as an aerial gunner training ground in the past. Tibbets believed that Wendover's remote location would improve security, which was a key consideration in his decision. His new command's combat unit would be the 393rd Bombardment Squadron, a B-29 squadron that was then undergoing training at Fairmount, Nebraska. The men of the 393rd had finished their training and were prepared for battle by the end of December 1944, when the 509th Composite Group was established. Where was the question? Japan was confirmed as the target in 1943. The original goal of the Manhattan Project, according to conventional atomic bomb lore, was to use the weapon against Nazi Germany. The project's scientists, many of whom were exiled Jews from Europe, were apparently encouraged to believe this. The War Department declared in January 1945 that the Germans were on the brink of defeat, and that Hitler's Germany was far from creating a nuclear weapon of its own. By this point, a few of the project's scientists were starting to doubt the viability of actually employing nuclear weapons. They had realized the potential consequences for a future world, as well as their incredible power. Since the bomb was no longer required to destroy Germany, several Manhattan scientists signed a letter opposing its further development. Actually, aside from maybe the first year or two of development, the bomb was never meant to be used against Germany. As early as May 5, 1943, the Military Policy Committee, a high-level organization that included Leslie Groves and was established to deliberate how best to employ nuclear weapons, determined that Japan was the right target for such a fantastic weapon. Over 2 years prior to the initial test of the new weapons, this choice was reached. The enormous supply station at Truk, which provided supplies for Japanese military operations in the Southwest Pacific, was one possibility. The Japanese were chosen to receive the bomb because they were less likely to secure knowledge from it as the Germans, potentially in the event a dud, according to the minutes of the May conference. Tibbets is a former U.S. It seems doubtful that the Air Force Brigadier General who passed away in 2007 was informed that the unit would drop bombs on Japan and Germany, long before it was ever close to happening, and more than a year before Tibbets even knew it existed. The decision was taken to use the bomb on Japan. According to Tibbets, Colonel Edward Lansdale, an Army Air Corps officer who had strong connections to the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, and its post-war successor, the CIA, and who also clearly functioned as a sort of special projects officer with the War Department during the war, briefed him on the bomb. The Allied approach to war. Without a doubt, Allied policy in the Pacific War led to the decision to target Japan with the bomb. President Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill agreed on a Germany First policy for the war's prosecution in December 1941, just days after the Pearl Harbor attack. The plan called for the Allied war machine to maintain a holding operation in the Pacific, while concentrating all of its efforts on defeating the Nazis, who were viewed as a greater threat than Japan. The full force of the Allies would be directed against Japan following the fall of Germany. The senior Allied authorities agreed upon timeline, which called for defeating Japan no earlier than 1947, was a glaring underestimate. The Allies had made very little headway in pushing the Japanese north when the decision was taken to deploy the atomic bomb against Japan. Japanese forces still held most of the Solomons and much of New Guinea after the battle for Guadalcanal, while the U.S. While the Pacific Fleet was rebuilding, the Navy was recuperating from the losses of its carriers at Coral Sea and Midway. It was thought that using such a potent weapon against Japanese installations in the Pacific would help hold the line and possibly go forward. The potential use of a potent new weapon against Japanese forces seemed reasonable given the military circumstances at the time. The prospect of such a weapon became much more alluring after the White House announced a new policy a few weeks earlier. In January 1943, following the Casablanca Conference, President Roosevelt announced a new approach to the media. The new approach was unconditional surrender, a phrase that was later rejected by Churchill and Roosevelt as being prepared, and that was not used in the conference communique. Even though many Allied military leaders felt that denying the Axis countries the chance to negotiate a surrender or truce would prolong the war and result in unnecessary casualties, the term was swiftly adopted by the media and quickly became a political catchphrase. Essentially, an unconditional surrender strategy gave none of the Axis countries any flexibility in negotiating terms for peace. It demanded an all-out war against both military forces and civilians. The proposal was reportedly created by Roosevelt, and after the American president made it public, Churchill reluctantly agreed to it. Controlling the communists. The Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, a brutal totalitarian who essentially could not have cared less about what Churchill and Roosevelt thought of anything, was the third member of the so-called Grand Alliance. The fourth main Allied leader was Chiang Kai-shek of China, but his position was mostly a formality. Chiang was frequently kept in the dark about the Big Three's objectives and strategies, and was not invited to the majority of the talks. Stalin had ambitious plans for Europe, if not the entire world, and was in many ways just as terrible as Hitler, if not worse. The Nazi invasion of Poland, which sparked World War II, is well remembered, but many people forget that Stalin's Soviet troops invaded the country from the east in tandem with the German attack and established an even more ruthless occupation army than the Germans. Thousands of Polish military officers were captured by Soviet forces and taken into the cotton forest, where their bodies were disposed of in trenches and executed. Only after Hitler violated their pact and invaded the Soviet Union, in the summer of 1941, did Stalin change his alliance, but not his loyalty, to the Allies. The corpses of almost 4,000 Polish officers, each with a single bullet wound to the head, were found in mass graves in the Katyn Forest during the German occupation of eastern Poland. In order to shield Stalin and the Soviet Allies, President Roosevelt, who was aware of the slaughter, lied to the American people and blamed the Nazis for the tragedy when Germany disclosed it. Stalin's true intentions for Europe were exposed in the late summer of 1944. Stalin stopped his soldiers outside Warsaw when the Polish resistance rebelled against the Germans, allowing the Poles to be massacred. When Soviet soldiers took over the region, Stalin essentially let the Germans do what he would have done himself. Many of the Allied politicians and military leaders recognized Stalin as a cruel and evil leader. Such authority was viewed by those who knew the nuclear secret as a way to restrain Stalin and the Soviet communists in the post-war world. President Roosevelt believed the Soviets were unaware of the atomic bomb's development because the Manhattan Project was classified. The Soviets were aware of every aspect of the initiative as it progressed, according to intelligence sources. Some of the scientists who worked on the bomb had communist sympathies, and Soviet scientists were conducting their own nuclear research in Moscow, while nuclear secrets were being smuggled in through Red operatives. Stalin was probably also well aware that the United States' grand strategy called for using nuclear weapons to ward off Soviet aggression following the war. Getting closer to the home islands. All fronts of the war were being won by the Allies in 1945, even though the Germans had launched a significant counteroffensive in the Ardennes forest the previous December. The Allies were able to resume the offensive by the new year because their advance had practically run out of fuel. Hitler's Third Reich was clearly coming to an end as Soviet forces advanced from the east toward Berlin. In the Pacific, there was also positive news. Allied forces fighting on a shoestring had defeated the Japanese in the Southwest Pacific and were moving northward into Japan, despite the fact that the original Churchill-Roosevelt plan, with Stalin and the Soviets neutral in the war against Japan, had called for holding the line in the Pacific. After initially landing at Leyte in October, American troops had now reached Luzon in the Philippines. As General Douglas MacArthur's air and land troops moved through New Guinea and approached the Philippines, Marines and soldiers under U.S. The Navy Command proceeded northward in their designated theater, the Central Pacific, after passing through the Solomon Islands. By 1943's end, the U.S. After recovering from its early setbacks, the Navy had grown into a formidable force. Early in 1944, carrier and land-based aircraft attacked the enormous Japanese store at Truk, which was quickly neutralized and removed from consideration as a potential nuclear target. In order to secure ground for the establishment of air bases from which the new B-29s might conduct airstrikes against the Japanese home islands, Central Pacific forces landed in the Marianas in the summer of 1944. It is widely held that the Japanese meant to fight to the death. While this may have been the case for the most extreme Japanese militarists, it was not the case for the country's civilian leadership or the general populace. Japan was not a dictatorship like Germany and Italy were. Although Japan was a monarchy, the government was actually led by a prime minister who was assisted by a cabinet consisting of both civilian and military members, and a parliament called the Diet. In addition, the Japanese people was divided into castes, with the rank and file belonging to the lower classes and the militarists to the aristocrats. The home islands of Japan had not been in grave danger before the Allied victory at Saipan. Allied triumphs had occurred in territories that Japan had seized in early 1942, despite the fact that the tide of the war had shifted in the Pacific in favor of the Allies. In April 1942, American bombers under Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle made a surprise strike from a single aircraft carrier, causing minimal damage in Japan. In order to protect the home islands from air attacks for over 2 years, Japanese forces in China launched an operation and took control of every region in China from which Allied bombers might launch attacks against Japan. The Marianas, with the exception of Guam, a U.S. territory, were a different matter. They are Japanese territory because the League of Nations ordered them to Japan right after World War I. Tokyo received a warning that Japan itself was in danger after Saipan fell. A new administration led by Koiso Kuniaki, a general in the Japanese army like Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, was formed when Tojo, who had taken office in October 1941, was forced to resign. Tokyo's first strikes. The United States launched an air campaign against Japan on the same day as the assault of Saipan, with the first mission targeting targets on Kyushu. The attack was executed by Indian-based B-29s that staged through advanced bases near Chongqing, China. Following the war, some of Japan's business titans claimed that the first B-29 strike made them understand the war was lost. The threat to Japan itself was evident even though the target suffered little damage, as the Allies were now within bomber range of the home islands. This threat was exacerbated by the fact that Saipan was close enough to Tokyo to permit attacks on the main island of Honshu, as well as Japan's industrialized areas surrounding Tokyo Bay. As Allied planes and submarines started to block the shipping routes that carried food and, more crucially, raw resources into Japan from the regions it had captured elsewhere in the Pacific, the nation was also starting to suffer. The routes that tankers had to travel to transport petroleum and crude oil to Japan were constantly under attack, even though the East Indies oil reserves were still in Japanese control. When B-29s bombed aircraft manufacturing facilities at Musashino in late November 1944, it was the first attack on the Tokyo area. Attacks persisted over the following few months, but the bombing effects fell well short of the Allies' expectations. The majority of the early B-29 operations against Japan were precision daytime raids on Japanese aircraft manufacturing centers. It would not be recognized until after the war, when the Allies had access to Japanese records, that several attacks had better outcomes than Allied intelligence suggested. U.S. Marines set foot on the small volcanic island of Iwo Jima, 650 miles southeast of Tokyo, in February. The primary objective of the invasion was to secure an emergency landing field for crippled B-29s returning from raids over Japan, as well as a base for escort fighters and B-24 liberators. The island also had an airfield that was used as a staging base for Japanese bombers on missions against the new American bases on Saipan. The battle for Iwo Jima proved to be one of the most fierce in Marine Corps history, because U.S. intelligence misjudged the Japanese fortifications. In a desperate battle, the Japanese defenders were motivated to kill as many Americans as they could, even though they knew they were doomed. Because of the huge number of Marine losses that followed, many Americans assumed that the Japanese people as a whole shared this mindset. However, Japan has not yet experienced the most devastating strikes in history. The full force of the air campaign arrives. Because the B-29 raids were unsuccessful, the 20th Air Force, the U.S., to attempt a shift in strategy with the Army Air Force's command element in charge of the long-range bombers. 20th Air Force strategists thought many buildings were vulnerable to incendiary assault, and Oriental construction techniques relied heavily on bamboo and even paper rather than steel and concrete. In December 1944, a spectacular incendiary raid against the Chinese ports at Hankou destroyed the city, which served as Japan's primary supply base in China. Although incendiary test flights were conducted against targets in Japan, the results were ambiguous, and high explosives attacks persisted. The results of 21st Bomber Command's incendiary assault against Tokyo in early March were undeniable. Many crew members believed the bombers were suicidal because they were ordered in at night at altitudes significantly lower than those of earlier missions. In order to enhance payloads, which included napalm and incendiary bombs, the B-99s were stripped of guns, ammunition, and gunners. Before the main force arrived, pathfinders entered and marked the target with napalm. The main force then used incendiaries to spread the fires. The raid's outcome was the most catastrophic incident in human history. A large portion of the city was destroyed by the firestorm, caused by winds whipped up by the fires. Water in the city's canals boiled due to the intensity of the flames. According to Japanese records, the flames caused 40,000 injuries and 83,000 fatalities. Before the American landings on Okinawa caused the B-29s to be diverted to strike airfields in Kyushu, 6 firebombing sorties were launched against targets around Tokyo Bay. As the Japanese defenders engaged in yet another obstinate struggle intended to result in as many losses as possible, the toll on Okinawa was once again high. Although the fall of Okinawa had a significant impact on American morale, the Japanese were far more affected. The Japanese cabinet was swapped out once again. Following the war, Admiral Suzuki Kantaro, the new prime minister, stated that Emperor Hirohito had given him instructions to find a means of bringing the conflict to a swift conclusion. The air campaign against Japan resumed with a vengeance as the struggle for Okinawa came to an end. In the meantime, hundreds more B-29s had reached the Marianas, enabling even bigger firebombing formations. Smaller B-24s from Iwo Jima joined the B-29s, and soon, liberators were flying from airfields on Okinawa and the neighboring island of Hiroshima. Another B-29 force was getting ready to land on Okinawa. With 5th Air Force fighter bombers and light and medium bombers hitting Kyushu, U.S. Navy carrier aircraft were now free to strike targets in Japan. The civilian leadership in Japan believed that the entire country would be destroyed if the war did not finish quickly, as their cities were literally being bombed into rubble. Additionally, While American submarines scouted Japanese waters, shutting off maritime routes to the Asian mainland, the home islands were cut off from their typical food supplies. The populace was in danger of hunger due to a lack of food and other necessities. In addition to the destruction of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the shortage of skilled combat pilots and air crews had limited the Japanese air forces to the point where they could only launch kamikaze strikes. The only remaining forces on the islands were the land forces, which consisted of untried troops who had never left the home islands and personnel with minimal combat experience, who had been redeployed from Manchuria and Formosa. The army was heavily relying on civilians, including all women between the ages of 16 and 40, who had been enlisted in a home guard and given rudimentary firearms. The only way for urban residents to escape the constant airstrikes was to evacuate to the countryside, as civil defense had all but vanished. Willing to give up, Moscow remained neutral in the conflict with Japan, despite the fact that the US, UK, and the Soviet Union were allies in the fight against Nazi Germany. Japan decided not to enter the war when Germany attacked the Soviet Union in June 1941. Similar to this, the Soviets turned down a request from the United States for air bases in the Soviet Far East, from which to attack Japan because they feared that doing so would force them into the Pacific War at a time when they were already deeply involved in the fight against the Germans. Japan started submitting peace proposals to the U.S. through Moscow as soon as it became clear that they would lose the war. Stalin decided not to forward the surrender offers to Washington because he had his own motivations for extending the war. However, the United States learned about the offers through message intercepts. After being decrypted, the signals were transmitted to the highest echelons of the American administration. Messages delivered through the Swiss embassy in Tokyo also suggested that the Japanese were willing to surrender. The Swiss ambassador to the United States was instructed to disregard the surrender feelers when he brought them to Washington's attention, and to advise his colleagues in Tokyo not to take any more of them. America's civilian leadership was well aware that the Japanese were about to surrender, and many senior military officers thought that a costly land battle would be unnecessary, even though the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines fighting the war were preparing to invade Japan and were terrified for their lives. Senior officials who were aware of Japanese capabilities but were not aware of the radio intercepts also thought that Japan would surrender without an invasion, particularly if assurances were made that the emperor would be permitted to keep his throne. General Douglas MacArthur, the top army officer in the Pacific and the man chosen to lead all Pacific troops in the upcoming invasion, was one officer who held this belief. According to reports, MacArthur, who had lived in the Orient for a large portion of his life and was familiar with Asian philosophy, told Washington in January 1945 that he believed Japan was about to surrender. Lieutenant General George C. Kenney, his chief of staff for aviation, is reported to have warned President Roosevelt and Army Chief of Staff, General George C. Marshall, that an invasion of Japan was feasible at the time. Our enemy was Russia. Following Roosevelt's death from a brain hemorrhage on April 12, 1945, Vice President Harry S. Truman became president. The former Missouri senator had only been in office for 2 months and had little knowledge of Roosevelt's foreign policy initiatives. Roosevelt hadn't even told him about the Manhattan Project, let alone his plans for using the atomic bomb. During World War I, Truman was a captain of artillery in the Missouri National Guard, and after the war, he became a colonel. He was assigned to lead a commission looking into defense procurement shortly after joining the Senate. He had come to despise the professional military and thought he understood military tactics and strategy, as well as, if not better than, the West Pointers and Annapolis guys who were in charge of the war. Only in 1995 was Truman's letter over the use of the bomb declassified after being classified for 50 years. For decades, supporters of Truman maintained that the president would not negotiate a surrender with the Japanese because the intercepted signals suggested that the Japanese did not want the emperor to abdicate. But it wasn't actually the case. In his autobiography, Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson wrote, "History might find that the United States, in its delay in stating its position on unconditional surrender terms, had prolonged the war." Although he was aware that the delay might have been caused by the desire to show the world, especially the Soviets, how powerful the atomic bomb was, Stimson did not mention that this could be the case. In a letter to Truman, former President Herbert Hoover cautioned him to be explicit about the United States' intentions regarding surrender. Hoover wrote that the Japanese would surrender without an invasion and save the deaths of up to 1 million Americans if they realized what the United States desired. General Groves, who had assumed leadership of the Manhattan Project in 1942, continued, "There was never, from about 2 weeks from the time I took charge of this project, any illusion on my part, but that Russia was our enemy, and the project was conducted on that basis." Troubles with Russia were connected to the future of the atomic bomb, said Secretary of War Stimson in late 1944. In response to other scientists' criticism of the project in early 1945, Arthur Compton, one of the driving forces behind the bomb's development, wrote to Stimson, "If the bomb were not used in the present war, the world would have no adequate warning as to what to expect if war should break out again." Such remarks leave little doubt that the main goal behind the development of the atomic bomb was to place the United States in a dominant position in the post-war world, and that in order to demonstrate its power, it had to be used before hostilities ended. Groves said that the use of the bomb was simply the continuation of a process that had already been started, and that there was never truly a decision to use it or not. Prior to his death, President Roosevelt made the decisions that nuclear weapons development would continue after the war, and that the bomb would be used on a Japanese target as soon as possible. Truman only carried on the legacy of Roosevelt's plans. General Carl Spaatz of the Air Corps was dispatched to the Pacific to lead the strategic bombing campaign against Japan following the Allied victory in Europe. He made briefings and a brief leave of absence in the United States en route. He was told that the bomb would soon be ready while he was in Washington, and he was instructed to use it as soon as it was. Spaatz, who had opposed American participation in terror bombing in Europe, told Generals Arnold and Marshall that he needed a formal command before using such a horrible weapon. 9 days after the first successful test, on July 25, 1945, the 509th Composite Group was given an order to drop an atomic bomb not later than August 10th. The 509th Composite Group was situated on the island of Tinian in the Marianas, and a bomb was already en route there. In his journal that night, Truman stated that he had approved the use of the worst weapon ever created only against a military target, not against women and children. Were the targets of the bombing strategically important? President Truman would say years after the war that he chose to use the bomb after General Marshall told him that an invasion of Japan may kill up to 1 million Americans. The amount most likely originated from the Hoover letter. Marshall made no such claim. Only a small portion of the casualties were anticipated from the original invasion of Kyushu. Less than 93,000 American combat casualties occurred in the Asiatic theater as a whole, accounting for about 1/3 of all American combat losses during the conflict. According to Truman, he also asked Secretary of War Stimson which Japanese cities were solely focused on producing war material, and he was told that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were included in this group. In actuality, neither was a significant hub for war manufacturing, and Hiroshima, Kyoto, Niigata, and Kokuru had been removed off the list of targets because the War Policy Committee had determined that they were good candidates for the new weapon and that they had not yet been affected by the conflict. The primary military significance of Hiroshima, the 8th largest city in Japan, was the location of the Second Army headquarters. The city was significantly less significant than other metropolitan areas, despite the fact that substantial war production took place there. Hiroshima would not have been protected from a conventional attack if it had been a strategically significant city. Because of its cultural and religious significance, Nagasaki had already been struck and was actually chosen as an atomic target by General Curtis LeMay, the chief of 21st Bomber Command, after Secretary of War Stimson removed Kyoto from the list. Being a major city in Kyushu, it could have played a significant role in the upcoming invasion. Nagasaki was only hit because Kokuru was hidden by clouds and orders required the bomb to be dropped visually rather than by radar, even though it was still ranked 3rd on the list. Were the bombs effective? Surprisingly, the mushroom cloud appeared in the skies over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, almost 3 weeks after the Trinity weapon was detonated in New Mexico on July 16th. Such rapid use was not necessary for military purposes. The Philippines War was in its mopping-up phase following the capture of Manila in March. The struggle for Okinawa had ended almost 2 months earlier, and the invasion of Japan was still over 3 months off. The Pacific War had come to a halt as Allied forces prepared for the impending invasion of Kyushu, and Germany had submitted. In other words, unless there was a legitimate concern that Japan might surrender before the atomic bomb could be deployed, there was no reason to hurry its use. As it was, the war continued after the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. The second bomb, dropped 3 days later on Nagasaki, didn't either. Japan responded with nothing but quiet. The deaths from the 2 bombs were significant. At least 40,000 in Nagasaki and over 70,000 in Hiroshima, but not as severe as those brought on by the firebombings of Tokyo and other Japanese cities. News of the explosions had little impact outside of Japan, despite the fact that the morale of the 2 cities where the bombs were dropped was destroyed. The significant distances between Tokyo and the 2 atomic bomb targets may have contributed to this. In any case, the Japanese people's morale had already fallen to its lowest points. Nearly 70% of people interviewed by Allied intelligence after the war stated that they were at their breaking point and could not stand another day of fighting. The Japanese leaders, meantime, were having heated debates. The Japanese military and civilian leadership were well aware of Emperor Hirohito's wishes to put an end to the war that was destroying his nation. After Saipan surrendered to the Allies in July 1944, Tojo was compelled to retire, causing a significant upheaval in the Japanese leadership. Although there had been a growing peace movement in the Japanese government since then, the military would not entertain any terms of surrender that would have deposed the emperor. Following the Allied invasion of Okinawa in April, a new government was established under Admiral Kantaro Suzuki, a former chief of staff of the Navy. After the war, Suzuki informed questioners that although the emperor had directed him to pursue peace, he had been afraid of the militarists, who were not above assassination as a way to hold on to power and influence. The war is ended by Hirohito. The Japanese leadership was deeply divided over the Allied Potsdam Declaration, which claimed that Japan would be completely destroyed if it did not surrender. 3 of the Supreme War Direction Council's leaders supported accepting the Potsdam terms right away, while the other 3 opposed them, arguing that there was no assurance the emperor would stay on the throne, and that demands were made to treat Japanese leaders as war criminals. Although he was unable to enforce his will, Hirohito was prepared to accept the Potsdam demands as worded, which were issued on July 26th, nearly 2 weeks prior to Hiroshima. 2 days after the bomb was detonated over Nagasaki, Suzuki finally asked Hirohito to hold an imperial conference to decide the matter. This was an unprecedented move because the emperor's custom was to approve or disapprove plans proposed by military and civilian leaders, not to advocate for decisions himself. Hirohito made the decision to agree to the terms set forth by the Allies, but in order to appease the militarists, Japan made the offer of surrender conditional on ensuring the emperor's safety and continued rule. Japan received assurances after Secretary of State James Burns suggested accepting the offer. In his first-ever radio broadcast to the country, Hirohito announced the surrender to the Japanese populace on August 14th. Hirohito, not Harry Truman, ultimately made the choice that put an end to the war and prevented an invasion that might have claimed thousands of lives. The atomic bombs. An inaccurate heritage? Americans instinctively and naturally believed that the atomic bombs were to blame for the Japanese surrender when word of it spread around the world. As they prepared for an invasion, hundreds of thousands of airmen, sailors, Marines, and soldiers thought they had been spared by the atomic bomb. They were unaware that the Japanese had tried to express their desire to surrender months before the bomb was detonated, because they were not privy to the intelligence that was available at the highest levels of government. On the other hand, many American leaders, especially those involved in the war against Japan, thought that the atomic bomb was not needed, and that Japan would have already surrendered without it. Members of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey arrived in Japan as soon as the fighting stopped and started a methodical examination of the Japanese cities that had been targeted. Air supremacy over Japan could have exerted sufficient pressure to bring about unconditional surrender and obviate the need for invasion, probably by November 1st. Certainly by the end of December 1945, the assessment concluded, even in the absence of the two bombs. Sam McGowan, the author, lives in Missouri City, Texas, and holds a pilot's license. He regularly writes for World War II History magazine.